fixing, whether in the health sector, the economics space, or energy. It's everywhere. And the energy that he brings to the conversations around policy development and development in Africa in general is fascinating. It is engineering solutions for tracking illicit drugs, cold chains, AI space everywhere, right? It's there. And we're grateful to have you here, to share your perspective with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so very much, Ben, and thanks to FAT Coalition for hosting us and Open Gov Hub for giving us this space. My talk is actually a presentation, so I'm going to wait for it to load up. Thank you so very much. First of the great presentation that preceded me gives us the global picture and talks about, primarily money leaving that could potentially stay and do good work. I'm going to focus on money coming in and why sometimes it doesn't come in the most optimal way. Essentially, we're looking at it from both ends of the spectrum. We have a timeline that we're dealing with. And if you think of that timeline from Monterrey in the early 2000s all the way to Seville this year, the challenge around financing for development has been primarily about these massive gaps between the money that we need to build schools, clinics, and do all of this stuff that is very important domestically and the money that's available. But there's also another timeline that goes all the way from Paris, 2005, thereabouts, to Busan, 2011, and that discussion was about optimality of the aid system. Basically, we have this financing for development agenda. One aspect of it is focused on plugging these gaps. Another is more quantitative in a certain sense, and another of them is much more qualitative. They are complementary processes, Monterrey to Seville, and then Paris to Busan. In both cases, the agenda has been around effectiveness. How do we make sure that financing for development finance, money that comes into countries with the goal of trying to make countries develop, how do we ensure that they are primarily effective? But the stark reality is that notwithstanding these processes, the gap between how much money we need for development and how much money actually goes to development keeps widening. And at this stage, depending on who you believe, it's maybe up to $4 trillion. So this is a huge gap. Then there's the issue around, okay, beyond the effectiveness of the system around the quantitative and the qualitative dimensions, how does accountability play? Who is accountable for this big gap? If you talk to global activists, many of whom are in this city today, this week, the issues are primarily to do with the global architecture, international financial architecture, the way multilateral institutions are set up, and the fact that they are not very accountable to weak voices. Let's think of poor countries, for instance. And I don't doubt that that's important, that's extremely important. But there's a missing piece of that accountability conversation, which is to do with the domestic level. And it's not just domestic level in terms of the leaders in the countries and how they are accountable to citizens. It's also about these multilateral institutions and how they are accountable to people on the ground in countries. And those two are very important and are often not very well discussed. So essentially, how do you ensure accountability of the global system? So the IMF, the World Bank, voting rights, all of this stuff, SDR reallocations, all of this is important. But in that global conversation, from our point of view as domestic activists, we find that there isn't sufficient focus on that bottom-up element of accountability. The accountability that happens in countries and how that affects the global structure. So I'm going to try and talk about official development assistance a little bit. But my emphasis, as I've tried to explain, is on accountability. Before I do that, though, it's important because, at this huge debate around official development aid, that we settle a number of key facts. One fact is that, contrary to a lot of the commentary nowadays, development aid is actually ubiquitous in modern history. So there's this notion that this is some kind of thing for looser countries, or it's only some countries in Africa that persistently depend on aid, and this is not a phenomenon that's important in economic history. It's not true. The United States, the country in which we're in right now, relied heavily on loans and grants from European countries, from Holland or the Netherlands and France in the early days of the Republic. Massive infrastructure. Buying of the Louisiana, the state of Louisiana, was based actually on Dutch finance. That's actually where the US got money to buy Louisiana from Napoleon. Japan relied heavily on World Bank funding for power plants and other critical infrastructure. China the biggest success story in development over the last half a decade, if you're thinking of just the number of people who moved out of poverty, rely heavily on Japanese funding for building a whole range of infrastructure. Nominal terms, $21 billion. If you adjust for inflation and other factors, over $100 billion from Japan. The last transfer from Japan to China was actually in 2022. So every country has used aid in one form or the other, as far as modern economic history is concerned. And I would place that from, let's say, the 1800s onwards. So that's the first stylized fact. The second stylized fact is that until somehow around 1968, most of that transfer of funds were very arbitrary and was driven primarily by geopolitical transactionalism. Essentially, maybe the heads of states like each other, they transfer money. Maybe they want you to help them with some particular claim to territory somewhere else, and they transfer money. So a lot of it was not based on a set of global norms that most countries are bought into. It was an attempt to create that, starting with the OECD Development Assistance Committee, began with the Pearson Commission in 1968. So that's the second stylized part that's important. And that attempt is to explain why today these reversals that we are seeing in the Trump era and the rest are not particularly interesting, because this is just an attempt to go back to the days when aid was entirely transactional. The third stylized fact, which I will delve into a bit more, and so the two at bottom are the most important facts for our conversation today. The third stylized fact is the fact that aid, as already has been pointed out, is small and declining. So we have a problem when we kind of over-rely on aid for development. The fourth issue, which I think is even more critical for my conversation, is that the biggest lever for development finance we have is the ability to turn vast amount of money that is in the private sector, use some conversion mechanisms to make it available for development. I'll give you an example. Third Wire, which more or less the system that private financial flows in the United States passes through, $4.5 trillion a day. Total ODA in a year, $212 billion last year. It doesn't even compare. We spend more on chocolates than we spent on global health aid the whole year. We spend more on Pokemon than we spend on vaccines, Gavi, Global Fund, medicines, etc., etc. So that tells you, the comparison in terms of what money is available in the private sector and what we have in the official sector, there's just no comparison. The trick is to find a way to get money from the private sector, convert it in some kind of formula, and give it to people. And that's what the World Bank and the MDBs have figured out. So they use callable capital, they use guarantee, they use all of these mechanisms. They go to the bond market and they raise money. It may surprise you to know that 93% of the World Bank money is not actually rich countries giving the World Bank money. It's the market giving the World Bank money. It's the World Bank borrowing the bond rates, reasonable bond rates. Then how do they convert that to low-cost capital for countries? That's the trick. They've got to find a way to establish what is often called preferred creditor status, to convince these investors that somehow the money is safe, that somehow they have the mechanism that even though these countries, if they borrow directly from the market, will not be trusted by the market, will be charged a very large amount of money or interest. If you give it through the World Bank, by letting the World Bank borrow from you through these bonds, the World Bank has a mechanism that allows you to lend to these countries at lower cost without endangering your funds. So it's a bit of a sleight of hand. It's similar to what we have in the domestic banking system, where you put your money in the bank and they tell you your money is completely safe, but at the same time, they've loaned the money out. And yet it convinces you that if you come and say you want your money immediately, they're going to give it back to you. It's a similar kind of sleight of hand, which allows all the multilateral development banks to raise money for the private sector and give it to poor countries. Okay. So having kind of laid the foundation, and I think I've established this point already, that because the ODA segment is so small and it's money across the entire range that matters, we need to focus a lot beyond ODA if you focus on the optimality of the system. Next. So here is the central theme of the talk, what we call constriction and moral absorption. Essentially, the multilateral development banks who go and borrow these amounts of money and therefore build a certain capital base to lend, or even to give it as grants. But the point is that they raise these monies in large amounts, and then they make allocations to countries that we call commitments. So they sign an agreement with Ghana and say, look, based on this grant agreement that we have with you, over a certain period of years, we intend to commit these amounts. And then for different specific programs, they make these allocations based on the design of the program. So let's say the program is roads and to enhance roads in the north of your country for agricultural optimization. They say this is going to be $200 million, and then they sign an agreement around that. So that's commitments. It's the highest level of these, the tiers that we're considering. The next step is that they have to release some of these monies as the project proceeds. And they don't give you the 200 million at once, of course. As the project proceeds and milestones are met, they release some of that money. That's called disbursements. And traditionally, the disbursement lack the commitments. Some of that is just obviously philosophical in the sense that obviously it takes you some time to get projects done and therefore this becomes time for the money to be released. The challenge is that when you annualize it to say, okay, what was the plan? Let's say you had a 3-year disbursement cycle. And throughout that 3 years, you annualize how much of that commitment is supposed to be disbursed. You get another gap, which reflects the fact that that release doesn't follow the expectation. So in essence, you have money sitting there that can't be released. And 2010 in Ghana, we got to a point where the gap between the money that's been allocated and what could be disbursed was as wide as 95%. Essentially, the money, only 5% of it was just being disbursed. And then the governments kind of doubled down, figured out a way to consolidate and increase disbursements again. So that takes us to the third level, which means that the government can improve disbursements. But what happened in Ghana over time was that I call it a compromise game. Because both sides do have an incentive to get projects going and money being released. Otherwise, the World Bank or the EIB staffer, their career is not looking too good if you can't disburse. So disbursement is important for both the World Bank and for Ghana, right? Or for Ivory Coast. What you then do is that you do the best you can to check enough boxes to get money to flow. So the checkboxing becomes more paramount. And that means basically that in some instances, impact surface, and that's what gets to the third level of effective disbursements. If you gave it too much, the World Bank may cancel the program and you have to return the money. And we've seen that in countries like Nigeria recently, water projects and things like that. So essentially, you have 3 levels. You have one level which is about commitments, and typically there's a set of guidelines you need to follow for the money to be released to you. If you don't follow those guidelines, the money doesn't get released to you. If the money doesn't get released to you, you have a disbursement shortfall. If you follow the guidelines, the money gets released to you, but because of the way you implement the project, you're not getting the performance out of the project. We call that a lack of effective disbursements. And in the extreme instance, you are actually asked to send the money back to the World Bank. So you have these 3 levels, and the argument is from the commitments level to the point where you actually get money into projects, there's a lot of missing opportunities to increase capital allocation. So in simple terms, even when you have money allocated, a lot of projects are still not getting money. And that kind of gap is often not talked about. So we talk about, okay, more money out. My point is that even when that money is made available, in some instances, we're not able to absorb the money. The second point on that graph is that we do absorb the money sometimes, but then it leads to, if we force it through, it leads to projects that are not optimal, and therefore the impact is not realized. So you have 2 issues, they're not the same. One is that actually a lot of the money is stuck in countries. And with effective governance, you could potentially release more money. But if you don't use effective governance and use what I call the compromise game, where both government and the World Bank kind of close their eyes on certain things, and they use metrics that are not very relevant to project success to get the project going, to get the releases going, then you get a challenge with the effective disbursements. So the disbursement improve, but the projects are not performing well. So these are the 2 levels of analysis. And then let's go forward and give you a few case studies. So this is just a placeholder, kind of like a dramatic story where Ghana has a relation with the Global Fund. It's one of these international organizations that gives resources for development, in this case, health. And every now and then they give medicines, to countries, they give vaccines, they give a bunch of things that are useful for health. We have this fascinating story where they brought a bunch of containers, like hundreds of containers of medicines in June 2023. So basically 2 years ago. It took more than a year for it to clear the goods from the ports. So you had a lot of people who needed medicine. You had a global fund that had got raised money, from all manner of places, bought these medicines and vaccines and sent them to Ghana, but they were just sitting at the port. We couldn't align a bunch of things to get the goods cleared. Why is this an interesting illustration? Because it tells you that it's not about the medicines being available, right? It's not about the money to buy the medicines being available. The medicines are being bought. They are in the country. Somehow you cannot release them into the population. So if you think of all the money spent for that and you use that year as your analysis, that's not an effective disbursement. You have allocated the money. You bought medicines with it. You've got vaccines. They are still at the port. But people are not taking those medicines. They are not receiving those vaccines. So effectively, that is an ineffective disbursement. And even though this is a kind of like a funny story kind of thing, in a way, a lot of the other more technical descriptions follow a similar pattern where you have the resources, but you can't use the resource. In 2008, there was a very famous report that a gentleman wrote about Uganda, and they made a story about, they recounted a story about the fact that you had so much money allocated to energy projects, but unfortunately, they just couldn't disperse the money into projects to actually deliver the energy. So this is a problem that we've known for a long time. In fact, one of the most detailed studies that the World Bank did on this was in 1964, when we were already talking about this challenge about disbursement. And over the years, my view is that rather than fix the governance issue that underline it, they've played a compromise game with the government to get these projects moving. And I'll show you in a minute in a much more detailed and technical form in a few minutes that I've got left, how that goes. So we, ASEP, all of us, civil society movement in Ghana, we've been doing a lot of these monitoring activities. One time, some of us decided to delve deeper into the World Bank's portfolio. So the World Bank is the biggest, obviously, multilateral funder in our country. And these are some of the projects that are very highly performing on paper. So somehow they figured out a way to ramp up disbursements on these projects. I'm not going to go into details of how, but I'm just going to try and explain that these are well-performing projects on paper. So somehow the disbursements are flowing. Next. We decided to apply a methodology we call forensic ethnography. Essentially, you go to the projects and you make an assumption that I'm not going to look at anything that is written about the project. I'm just going to go and observe, which almost nobody does. It's funny enough, almost nobody does. Like everybody goes and reads the reports and they try and synthesize stuff. And we said, no, forget about the reports that the World Bank has written. We're just going to go look into these projects and talk to people, almost like investigative journalists, as opposed to researchers doing desk review. And we discussed some very interesting things. So there is a E-Gate project, which has been going on for, the World Bank has been working on it for a very long time in Ghana. And this E-Gate project is fascinating. Basically, the idea was two things. One, the software that you use to monitor or manage migration into Ghana. So if you're coming to Ghana, you're entering Ghana, not always migrate, just entry and exit. The software that, they keep some stuff in there, then they scan your passport, and they let me in. That software was donated by the US government to Ghana. And it's been managed and supported by Booz Allen Hamilton here in Washington for many years. Now, some people go around and say, oh, this is not national security compliant. I mean, it's ridiculous. Why should the US donate to software to Ghana? The truth of the matter is actually the fact that that software was in the control of the Ghanaian government. And if they wanted to change anything about it, they could have, or they could have replicated it. But the truth is, people then use that as a basis to say we needed a project to have sovereign control of our own software for managing migration and for entry and exit. So the World Bank makes money available. And then they said, okay, but the world is also moving beyond just, manual processes of somebody entering the data. Why don't we have an electronic mechanism so you can move quickly once you go through the airport? So that leads to this project with e-gates, a secure border management system, and an e-visa system, so that applying for visas to come to Ghana is very easy. Just go online and do it. The truth is, all the money has been disbursed on this project. In fact, it got to a point where they said, well, Ghana built a new terminal, so the project needed to be relocated to the new terminal and release even more money. Will it surprise you to know that nobody can find these devices or this software? You can't find them, like they don't exist. Well, they exist on paper in the sense that Thales, which is a French multinational, was contracted, they built some stuff or whatever, but somebody has disappeared them. You know the way they talk about disappearing in terms of human rights, they disappeared a political opponent. Somebody who didn't like the fact that this project didn't make enough money for whoever it is that they like or whatever, disappeared the systems. So you can't find where the systems are. Nobody will talk to you about where the systems are. And then later on, a very well-connected entrepreneur who supports the government in other areas suddenly discovers that it's a big problem in Ghana. We don't have an e-gate system. We don't have an integrated e-immigration system, and conjures a $300 million program that the previous government nearly disbursed on, which meant, therefore, that the World Bank's $20-something million, which was satisfactory for this, is gone into a sinkhole. But on paper, the project went through, everything was done, all the checklists was done, the project was successful. And the project doubled. We have similar problems like that. Next slide. We have similar problems like that with the road safety platform, which is supposed to involve a call center and a software app, etc., to try and monitor safety on the roads. And there's supposed to be a number that you can call to make a report, and there's a whole elaborate mechanism. Doesn't exist. It exists on paper, like they've gone through the processes, it's probably been built, somebody has the software somewhere, and we have the same story with drones that are supposed to monitor illegal mining, drones that are supposed to monitor drainage systems to avoid flooding. They all exist. I'm sure they've been bought. I'm sure the drones are sitting somewhere, but they've been disappeared because somehow somebody doesn't like the way the project was conceived and structured and wants to give other contracts that perhaps are more favorable. Now, this is very interesting because what that means, next slide, what that means, therefore, is that it doesn't matter the disbursement level of the project. If you don't go to this further level of effective investment, then you get into trouble. So in the ESRP, for instance, the Energy Sector Reform Program, which is an attempt to solve recurrent blackouts in Ghana, and you spend hundreds of millions of dollars from this World Bank money. Somehow they write glowing reports, but when you go in and you look at local audited accounts, you look at what the likes of Ben does and ASEP does, there's constant problems with the money and its utilization, including containers that the state-owned distributor brings in of supplies supposed to be used for the grade that somehow sits in the port and then vanishes, about 1,000, more than 1,000 of them, and nobody can find out where they are, and it's like it's been disappeared. So this disappearing thing is very fascinating. Next slide. There is a case study we're working on the Development Bank of Ghana, which illustrates another aspect of it, where a lot of money was put into and included by the World Bank and others, setting up a development bank for Ghana, so Ghana can have a domestic development finance and strategy on its own. And then we had leaks from people inside the bank across different functions that are important, like risk audit and the rest, suggesting that there's money being wasted like nobody's business. This is a bank that's like 60 people. The software, the core banking system, and it's a wholesale bank. They just give money to other banks. The core banking system alone cost more than $17 million. And much of that money had been dispersed without the projects, moving on. In fact, in one instance, we found out the real costs of the platform, the terminal platform that they had bought, had been inflated by more than 3 times. And you just have to simply go to the original vendor and find out. In all of this, the publications are done, the World Bank simply doesn't have to respond. So in one case, they issued a statement that they are investigating, and it's been more than, I think, several weeks now without any kind of explanation. So one of the things that I'm trying to explain is that the accountability mechanism is broken at the domestic level, because all these things I've talked to you about, we've published them, I've gone to the World Bank office, presented it to them, there's been just no response. And so in that sense, that accountability mechanism that leads to this constriction, genuinely that prevents money from reaching people who need it through that multilateral finance, concessional financing window. And it leads to a situation where, some of you might then say, okay, maybe it's a World Bank alone, maybe it's Ghana alone, etc. But we actually have tried, maybe not as rigorously as we've done in Ghana, to look at other kinds of investment through that concessional financing window. And we think this is a generalizable problem. Of course, we need to do more studies in more countries and the likes of it. But from what we know so far, this is a generalizable problem. Why is this the case? And I'm going to wrap up on this set of slides. The reason why this is the case is because for a very long time, we've confused political accountability and policy accountability. So if you take indices that look at voice and accountability, you find out that countries that are highly democratic in Africa, like Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, where you have vibrant democracies, are supposedly supposed to have more voice. The citizens are supposed to be able to say more things, which theoretically is more political accountability. My arguments this morning and my pitch to you is that political accountability is not the same as policy accountability. Why? Because the audience for policy in every country is very small. So you could effectively have a situation where in a particular area, there's more accountability in China than in the US on policy level. Because it's a matter of who is the audience for that accountability. It's not every average citizen. It's a group of people that can specialize in policy, understand these things, follow these things, have the leisure, the rest of it. And therefore, you can have as much democracy as you want. If you don't have a certain national audience that's cultivated in respect of those policy matters, the level of accountability in that country, regardless of that democracy, is very low. So that's the key point I'm making this morning, in terms of how we kind of make progress on this. That then leads to some fascinating situations. So if you look at Ghana's CPIA, this is basically the World Bank's composite measure of how a country's governance is faring. It's called the CPIA. You find out that in Ghana, the general CPIA is better than the sub-Saharan average. But when you drill down to certain areas that are key to managing development finance well, they feel that Ghana seriously underperforms. So the average doesn't really give you enough insight about those aspects of governance that matter. And it doesn't matter, therefore, that, if you take many democratic and accountability measures and matrices and indices in the world, and you compare Ghana and Ivory Coast, Ghana will outperform Ivory Coast on average as a more vibrant democracy. But on policy accountability, my view is that Ivory Coast is getting better because of the way in which the current government has set up some of the institutions and made them accountable among each other. And therefore, it's not surprising that you see increasing performance on the CPIA for Ivory Coast, and a stagnant situation for Ghana. And my argument is this leads to a phenomenon that we call political dysphonia, which is that the voice exists, but it's a voice disorder. So the citizen has voice, there's democracy, there's vibrant debate, but the policy at the policy level, the number of people that we don't have a critical mass of an audience that actually is interested enough in policy to make this way. So what is the solution there? The solution there is that we need to start centering domestic governance again, because the focus for a lot of these discussions have been on fixing the global system, global architecture. The second thing that we have to do is recognize that the resources themselves are somewhat fungible. It doesn't really matter whether it's domestic taxes or it's ODA or you have to have a central governance strategy that, regardless of where the money is coming from, we need to be sound. The third element is that you need to figure out how to build a technocratic audience that is also activist. So one of the challenges we have in Ghana is that a lot of the academics and the likes who could form the national audience for policy, like you had this in China. I'll give you a practical example in China. You've got party schools. Those party schools have think tanks in them. So you sometimes find the most trenchant criticism of government policy in China, but it's got nothing to do with the democratic environment. It's entirely due to the fact that in party schools, you have ideologues who very often subject ministers and their performance to critique within the context of the party. So the Communist Party itself has those structures for that. So you may not have democracy in the country, but on a policy level, the degree of scrutiny can be higher than, say, in France. And you can't do that without a technocratic activist posture. Technocrats meaning people who know this stuff, this policy stuff, but are willing to put the government to account. I think that's my last slide. And that requires some kind of smart citizenship model, where, to my mind, all the projects that are done on an MDB basis, World Bank, IMF, all of these projects, they have to be civil society involved. Because the current situation now is that the World Bank staffer who designed the project and is responsible for its outcome also reads the project. It makes no sense. Absolutely makes no sense. You need to have civil society involved in project execution, project design, and playing a monitoring role. So otherwise, you have a fossilized arrangement. The mechanics exist on paper, but it's not active. They lack an active essence. And I think the last point that I will make is that until we have this global gap between domestic activists and international activists, unless we have this gap between, until we reduce this gap between domestic activists who have a certain sense of the nuance and international activists purporting to try and reform the global development architecture, unless we bridge that gap, we're going to have these two wells, where some people think it's all about voting rights on the IMF and maybe we should increase Africa's voting rights and things like that. And then there are people that can't think that all that doesn't matter because people are wasting the money and there's just no dialogue. So we need to bridge this global and domestic level and to make progress. Thank you so much. And sorry for being about my time.
Thank you so much, Bryce. I think the presentations have actually shown us that we have money living, and also those that are coming in are not optimized to actually ensure that Africa is developed. And that's a big problem for us. And between himself and I, these are issues we are taking really seriously and confronting the bank, in particular, some of these issues to make sure that the money that they are investing actually optimized. Yes. And the struggle still remains. How do we even carry along at least the middle class in our societies for them to appreciate that we can do better with the resources that are actually coming in the long term, so blocking what is actually leaving our countries. And always, like he indicated, we have resources in our countries that are actually funding a counter narrative to let the public believe that the resources are being spent in their interest. So when you raise an issue with how development is financed, you will still have people, even in the middle class, who would come strongly defending the politicians and saying that these are actually in their best interest. And we always have that problem. So building capacity, raising critical voices to actually support these efforts are extremely important. And we will keep at it. Tomorrow we have an engagement with the bank itself. They have called for us to engage on these matters. So we're hoping that we can still push to engineer policy. We don't have much time, but we have short time for questions. Probably take one or two from here, and then we'll have a couple on online, from the online participants. So if there are questions in the room, we will take them, and we can take the online. Okay.
Thank you very much, Brian.
You can direct the question.
Okay, so Bright, 3 times on the row I've been awarded the best investigative journalist, best road safety journalist, currently best road safety. So I was intrigued by this thing you showed us about the road safety policy. I don't know about it. The Minister of Roads, whoever, I mean, these are people I speak to every day, but I don't know about this. So how do we bridge this gap? You know, I'm an investigative journalist. What you were doing is like related to what I do. But how do I get the right information to hold these people accountable? Because I want to. How do we do that? That's what I want to know. Thank you.
So 2 great presentations. My question for Bright is that within the case of Ghana, you did not mention the IMF. And so I'm wondering if there are different accountability dynamics with the IMF, if the IMF is doing a better job of not just looking the other way when there are accountability, governance, or corruption challenges, given the fact that the Ghanaian government has been forced to get IMF programs several times over the last couple of decades. What is the accountability dynamic there? And for the World Bank, are there any examples? You know, I've been following Ghana since the early 90s. Are there any examples where the World Bank has actually not looked the other way and called the government to account for wasting of resources? For Zorka, my question is if you could explain in a bit more detail how African tax authorities might use in a practical way the public country by country reporting to increase tax revenues in their country.
Online.
Okay, so maybe let me run through quickly some of the online questions so we can take them. Okay, Brian has a question.
I missed the first presentation, right? Fascinating as usual. Clearly, you present 3 challenges. The first is a conversation on reimagining democracy that bridges this question of policy and political accountability and pays attention to accountabilities that go beyond regime typology. And because I think that that actually is a conversation that needs to be had, the limits of regime typology characterization to actual delivery, not just on RTA, but delivery on other. In fact, I was going to give you an anecdote. I was sent as part of a team go and support the Eritrean government when I was still in the UN. We arrived there at the same time the bank and the fund were trying to re-engage Eritrea. And the bank folks said to me, of all the countries that they had assessed on utilization of MDG funds at the time, Eritrea was the best performing because they could account for until the last cent. And when they actually went to do a review, which is a fiscal inspection, they found out that actually everything that was indicated had been done. Which brings me to the second question of looking at a narrative we've pushed quite a bit, and then perhaps one that we need to nuance on private sector-led growth. So some of the money that's disappeared hasn't just disappeared into individuals, because these individuals may run companies, and these companies are linked to European and American suppliers. Also curious to how much actually, I know that in consultancy services, for example, before the EU issues $100 million for Africa and etc., mega EU consultancy firms are already trying to recruit locally to bid for this. You know, it's like in private sector, would call it insider trading. So literally these funds actually never quite arrive on the shores. So when we're bridging these 2 things, this domestic accountability may mean two things: domestic accountability in the sending country, right? And domestic accountability in the recipient country, but that covers private sector, public sector, and others. I mean, there's a whole thing, I think you call them intermediaries, but fascinating, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So maybe Bryce can sit here and then I can sit here, so we can run real quickly. So some of the online. So what policy reforms are most critical for African countries sustainably mobilize domestic resources in the absence of consistent global aid? And there's another one also that says, how can African governments strengthen transparency and accountability in public finance to prevent resource leakage and corruption? And how can innovative strategies be adopted to expand the tax base without disproportionately burdening the informal sector, the low income sector? In Africa, nations effectively tackle illicit financial flows and tax evasion by multinational corporations operating within them. We have many others, but we can take a few.
Okay, great. A lot of questions, great questions and great, incredible presentation from Bright. Thank you for that. Really insightful. There was a question how African tax authorities can use tax transparency information that I discussed, and it's really important point that I didn't mention is that the global agreement under the OECD limits, very severely limits the purposes for which the information can be used. So it's really only meant for risk analysis and not actual tax assessments or tax collection. And that's a huge problem. It really kind of ties. So even if the countries jump through all the hoops and satisfy all the conditions, their hands are still tied and they cannot use the information for enforcement purposes to collect taxes. Even in really extreme examples, like if you imagine, there's a company that is filing reports in their home jurisdiction, maybe it's in the US, maybe it's somewhere in Europe, and it includes all of this information about revenue, profits, et cetera, in Ghana, for example. But they're not even filing a tax report in Ghana. So it's just mind-boggling that the Ghanaian government would not be able to do anything about that under the OECD agreement. And that's one of the reasons that we really feel it would be advantageous to make the information public, and these limitations on use would fall away, so the government could really kind of take a look at where these companies are doing business, where they're booking profits, where whether there's tax haven activity involved, and really kind of properly scrutinize that and make informed decisions about also how to prioritize their limited enforcement resources. Because one of the things we talked about is, and I don't need to dwell on it, but there are resource and capacity constraints, and so you want to make sure that the governments are prioritizing going after the taxpayers that potentially owe the greatest amounts of money. So this would really help them to better prioritize their limited resources. There were also some of the other questions I'll just maybe briefly touch on. I think you mentioned someone asked about the informal sector. That often comes up in discussions of DRM and Global South countries. What I would say, I think there could be too much focus on that, given the revenues at stake from these are mostly kind of small businesses, so it's not the pot of potential tax revenue that can be raised there is not huge, and it pales in comparison to we're talking about these huge companies, whether it's mining companies or other sector, digital, et cetera. So I think that there's, if anything, I would say there's too much attention that is in policy discussions, has been paid to that, and not enough to where the money actually is. Because you can't, you know, I mean, you can't really kind of squeeze water from a stone if that's what we're trying to do. I think that's not the best approach. So I would like to see the policy discussions reorient towards really, you know, where the money is. And my focus was on tax, but I know Bright also talks about, you know, how we can mobilize the private sector better. And so I think that's another better place to look. So I'll stop there and hand over to Brian, and then we can continue discussion.
Okay, wonderful. So first question about how can the media and civil society work better in ensuring that there's more accountability. From my experience in Ghana, I think that, you know, we have some of the problems that every other country has around corporate ownership and the fact that it's a very small economy. So the media is really very constrained in holding, especially the private sector, because they just withhold adverts, right? They withhold advertising. And on the government side, we have political ownership of media, which has also led to a situation where the media is part of the political dance. You know, one part of the other one part. But because of the nature of that confusion, what has happened is that when anything comes up, getting some degree of consensus about, you know, the normative aspect of things gets very difficult. So you don't have any basic elite consensus. And one of the challenges in African media that I've begun to realize is this lack of distinction between fringe and mainstream that is increasing. You know, this distinction, I think in the US, no matter all the problems that we have with polarized media, there is still clarity as to what's mainstream media and what's fringe media. In Ghana and some African countries, that distinction is becoming harder and harder to enforce. And the reason is because you have media that is extremely oriented towards serving particular political ends. You know, so it doesn't matter what the issue is. The agenda is very much, you know, to serve a particular cause. And so when you have that kind of polarization, and it does not allow you to distinguish between at least the middle, that's mainstream, that gets very challenging. But on the CSO side, on the society side, I think working with the media will be more effective if there was a greater sense that that media constituted enough of an audience for the kind of policy conversation that the CSOs want to have. And right now, you know, this lack of mainstream middle class audience means that the media that tries to do that actually becomes the fringe. So it's a reverse problem. So here, I'll give an example. The top media houses in the US have a much smaller audience than the populist media on social media, YouTube, podcast, radio. But the mainstream audience for policy exists within that smaller mainstream, the Wash Post, the NYT, and the rest. In Ghana, it's the other way around. The small number of press, Nova reports, what you do at Graphic, those groups are actually by far considered the fringe, and the mainstream is the populist media. So we have a very fascinating reverse problem to deal with. And I think a lot of African countries has been the same feature. And I think while that remains, any kind of conversation about some of these things will be very difficult to push. I don't know how you solve that problem, but I think we have to think about it very hard. Then there's the issue around the IMF and the World Bank and whether there's a distinction between the two. As most of you know, the IMF does acute relief. So they give you money to stabilize your economy when there's trouble, and often about 3 years. And then they hand you over to the World Bank. That's in theory what's supposed to happen. So the World Bank does the long-term management of the chronic condition. So one is chronic, one is acute. The problem is that on the IMF side, that enabled the IMF to pass the buck. Because within 3 years, you can create some artificial stability. And they've done it every time. So every time we have trouble, we call the World Bank. We keep saying that, you know, we've gone there 17 times. But what we don't say is every time we go there, they do stabilize us. That's why we keep going back. So in a way, they do their job, right? You come in, you have 50% inflation, you have exchange rates that's going through the roof at 35%, and then they bring you back to 20% inflation, they bring you back to 10% exchange rate depreciation. Yeah, good. So if you look at the 17 programs, the same structural issues keep recurring. Exemption, tax exemptions that are a mess. I've seen it in almost every single IMF program. So the problem is the handover is not effective. And I think the handover to the IMF, the handover from the IMF to the World Bank itself doesn't make sense. The World Bank contributes such a small proportion of the total resource at risk that handover to the handover to the World Bank will never be sufficient. So I think that's the way there's handover to some domestic ecosystem. And that ecosystem doesn't exist at present. So that's the problem. In terms of whether or not they are less accountable, I'll say they are just like the World Bank. They are a governmental organization. So their accountability is really to the governments, the same governments that they are supposed to supervise. And so for our civil society, they allow us to come in here like here and do a society forum on the sidelines. But we're never part of it. We'll never be, because of the nature of the treaties, we'll never be part of the mainstream of how you exact accountability. Because the same Minister of Finance that they're supposed to supervise is also their governor. So there's just a structural conflict of interest that will never change. On regime typology, I think, Brian, that's brilliant. That we have to start moving beyond regime typology. We definitely have to, because I think it's become a bit of a funny dance where, you know, DRC is supposedly democratic and Rwanda is supposedly not democratic. And I mean, you go around and then you look at all of this stuff. None of it is adding up to anything. You know, what is democracy? I think we've got to a level where we need to start becoming much more deeper and nuanced about what are we describing, you know, democracy where, for whom, etc. I'm not saying that the human rights dimension is not important. I think it's very important. But then let's stay on human rights, because in Ghana, one of the biggest success stories of Ghana for the last 3 decades is that the human rights improvement is dramatic. There's no political prisoner in Ghana. The only people who came close to being a political prisoner is this Fix the Country activist who clearly rigged the judicial system to keep him in jail. But apart from that episode, for the last 3 decades, 0 political prisoners, very little degree of political repression. So on that score, democracy is working, if you're going to look at human rights and political repression. But the other aspects of nationhood, there's economic governance. And my view is that until we get that to that granular level, we just throw words about in terms of democracy and the likes of. And the spectrum between the deeds of international private capital potentially and domestic private capital is very interesting. We haven't looked into that in great detail, but we do know that in Ghana, a lot of the companies that often get these contracts, and they get these contracts on very soft terms, they don't tend to have the kind of international connections to corporations in the West that you might think. So if you think of those in sanitation, the biggest conglomerate in sanitation, for instance, its initial relationships were primarily in China, which is why when it was blacklisted by the World Bank for certain practices in certain countries in Africa, it had no impact on its international exposure. So we have to also recognize that for a lot of these corporations, I think they're going to increasingly be more focused on building relationships with the UAE, with China and the rest. And we all pay lip service to the same global norms. But the truth is, if you want to apply some of the standards that Zoka is talking about to UAE, you're going to have it very difficult. And so we pay lip service to this global normative structure, but not all countries are bought into it. The difference is that they don't argue about it. So UAE is not going to sponsor a campaign against some international regime. We're just not going to apply the way you want them to comply with. I think we have to start to recognize those facts, that we don't have a truly unified global view on some of these norms that those of us in this room are pushing. And what do we do about that? And the West centricity, the extreme focus on the West, while good in exacting accountability, is going to start giving us trouble as economic power shift from the West. That's Russia, China, India. I'll give you an example. Most people here may not be aware that Turkey has more defense pacts with Africa than any country in the world. Yes. So how am I going to get, as a domestic activist, what am I going to get from Turkey? Forget it. When I'm going to go to the Turkish embassy and try and get information about what Turkey is doing in Ghana, God bless you. Yeah. God bless you. Forget it. So we live in a world where a lot of power is shifting away from this Brussels consensus about how we do governance. But because of the fact that we are so stuck on this scrutiny or the spotlight on the West, we're losing the fact that we need to have conversations about this changing world. How do we get the UAE, Saudi, Turkey, all of these countries that are very active now in Africa? Last example, gold, which you do a lot of work in economic resource. The biggest player in gold in Africa now is the UAE. It's the biggest by far. You think that they care about responsible source and that they don't define, and they define in Switzerland? They don't. So if gold is being used as money laundering and you sit in DC, you sit in London, you can sign all the global pacts you want. It's not going to make an impact in Dubai. So that's the world we live in now. How are you going to create this world which is truly multilateral? But I think we are stuck in a world of the 1950s. That's our understanding of how the geopolitics is structured. And all the technocratic demands on the system are based on a world that has dramatically changed. I think that's a problem. And the last issue around increasing domestic resources and what do you do to increase domestic resources? I think we suffer from what I call the paradox of essentialism, which I mean that when we as Africans have to invest to solve our problems. a lot of the things that are important come across as non-essential. I'll give you an example. Over 70% of the African Union budget must be funded by Europeans. Because if you sit in Togo and you got to build a school or to pay your dues to the African Union, paying your dues to African Union is not essential. Actually, it's not essential. That's the problem. Because without having a unified African Union strategy on trade and things like that, how are you going to go and negotiate with Trump? Forget it, Togo. But there is some problem in terms of being able to set these essentialisms. Or there's a lady friend of mine who is trying to build tricycles and bicycles, but make sure they're all green. There's electric powered bicycles and tricycles. And she struggled to get the policy alignment in Ghana because we have an automotive policy in Ghana that favors big global corporations coming there to just assemble vehicles. And she can make more of just the use IP. She can make more of these tricycles and bicycles. But the policy doesn't recognize it because the policy focuses on cars, which are four-wheelers. Now, to get Ghana to fix those things, make sure the financial environment responds to it and the rest of it, forget it. Because we haven't built schools. We have schools under trees. So even though certain things are extremely essential on the soft side of development, which is the only thing that is going to take us out of poverty, somehow you can plausibly argue that they are not essential. And I think part of the reason why it becomes difficult to increase tax to GDP, which is one of the biggest challenges we face, is because so many of the changes that must happen, when you line them up and you put them against building clinics, building schools, and the rest, all this other stuff feels non-essential, plausibly. And conceptually, I'm not able to bridge that gap. I don't know how to, is it a communication issue? I don't know, but there is a situation in which so many important things don't get done because in the larger scheme of things, it's easy to argue that they're not essential. And I think until we do those things, forget about increasing tax to GDP ratio because you will end up focusing on the status quo, gold, whatever. That's not the future of Africa. The future of Africa is really about transforming the innovative landscape to enable small business and big businesses. That's not going to happen with extractives. Yet still, when you are thinking about how do you dramatically increase with domestic resources, the set of policies that will lead you to that, the future is stuck in the status quo. Because those are what are essential. So this paradox of essentialism, I think, is critical. And I think we need to do more thinking about what it means. But I have not been able to go beyond just articulating it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We've taken a bit more time, but it clearly indicates that we have a lot more work to do, trying to see how we optimize resources and actually engineer development in a way that benefits the masses. So this is the beginning of partnership and collaboration around the subjects of optimizing resources, those that are flowing in and those that are flowing out of our countries to make sure that we can develop the content. So on behalf of the audience, thank you, Dr. and Bright, for joining us. Thank you very much, everyone.
In heaven knows where we are going, but we know we will get there. We are going, heaven knows where we are going, but we know we will get there. Boom, 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 boom. We will get there. Heaven knows how we will get. We know we will get there. Heaven knows where we are going, but we know we will get there. Boom, 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 boom. We know that the road will be muddy and rough, but we will get there. Heaven knows how we will get. We know we will get there. Boom, 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 boom. Boom, 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 boom. We know that the road.
It was saved on the cloud. You have to convince. It was saved on the cloud.